The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, the room shifted. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. What she laid out wasn't a slogan or a soundbite. It was a chain of receipts, timelines, and quiet contradictions pointing straight at Speaker Mike Johnson. For weeks, the story around Johnson had been carefully managed, sanitized, and protected. But Crockett didn't argue the narrative. She dismantled it, piece by piece. And by the time she was done, the question wasn't whether Johnson had a problem. It was how long the dam had been cracking before anyone noticed. It didn't start with a viral exchange or a dramatic confrontation. It started quietly, buried in procedure, timing, and decisions most people don't have the patience to track. That's exactly why it worked for as long as it did. Jasmine Crockett begins by rewinding to the moment everyone skipped over, the meeting that didn't make headlines, the rule adjustment framed as routine, the language slipped into documents few outside the chamber ever read. She walks the audience through how power actually moves when no cameras are rolling, showing how seemingly minor procedural choices can shape massive outcomes later. Nothing she points to looks explosive on its own, and that's the trap. Each step appears defensible, technical, even boring. But when she aligns them in order, a structure emerges. Decisions that weren't debated publicly. Processes that limited scrutiny. Timelines that only make sense when you stop assuming good faith. Crockett doesn't accuse anyone yet. She simply reconstructs the scene the way it actually unfolded, stripping away the polished after-the-fact explanations. The effect is unsettling because it suggests the real story wasn't hidden behind secrecy, but behind complexity. The setup was never meant to outrage voters. It was designed so most of them would never notice it at all. What stands out immediately is not what she says, but how she says it. There is no raised voice, no performative anger. None of the theatrics audiences have been trained to expect. Jasmine Crockett speaks slowly, deliberately, as if she is inviting everyone in the room to follow along rather than daring them to react. That composure is intentional. It signals preparation, not impulse. Each sentence is paced to land cleanly, giving listeners time to process the implications before she moves on. The calm creates contrast, especially in a political environment built on interruption and outrage. Instead of fighting for attention, she assumes it. This forces her audience, including her opponents, into a reactive posture. The restraint also reframes the moment. Viewers don't perceive a partisan attack. They see a methodical presentation. That distinction matters because it lowers defenses while raising stakes. Her tone suggests she is not trying to win an argument, but to establish a record. When she pauses, it feels deliberate, as if she is allowing the weight of the information to settle before continuing. The absence of emotion becomes its own form of pressure. It implies confidence that the facts, presented plainly, are enough. For years, Mike Johnson's reputation has been carefully cultivated around consistency, discipline, and moral clarity. Publicly, he presents himself as a procedural purist, someone who respects institutional norms and governs by principle rather than impulse. That image is reinforced through interviews, press statements, and carefully framed floor appearances where he emphasizes transparency and order. Jasmine Crockett doesn't challenge that image directly. Instead, she places it side by side with the record Johnson rarely discusses. She pulls from votes taken out of the spotlight, procedural allowances granted quietly, and strategic silences that don't align with the persona voters are familiar with. The contrast is subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, which is precisely why it's effective. Crockett shows how the public-facing version of Johnson depends on selective visibility. What he highlights reinforces trust. What he omits complicates it. As she walks through the documentation, it becomes clear that the private record isn't chaotic or reckless, but it is opportunistic. Decisions are made with precision, often exploiting gray areas that never make it into campaign messaging. That's where the tension forms. Johnson's defenders rely on his reputation, but Crockett anchors her argument in actions that exist independently of spin. She doesn't claim hypocrisy outright. She lets the mismatch speak for itself. The more she aligns Johnson's stated values with moments where those values were quietly set aside, the harder it becomes to reconcile the two. Viewers begin to understand that the issue isn't whether Johnson follows rules, but which rules he chooses to spotlight and which ones he prefers remain invisible. The shift happens when Crockett stops describing the process and starts anchoring it to something tangible. She introduces material that already exists in the official record, not leaked documents or anonymous claims, but items that pass through the very systems Johnson oversees. The power of this moment is that nothing is speculative. These are approvals, filings, and procedural acknowledgments that bear institutional legitimacy. Crockett doesn't dramatize their introduction. She references them almost casually, as if assuming everyone is already familiar. That assumption alone raises tension. As she reads select portions into the record, the language is unmistakably clear, stripped of the ambiguity Johnson's allies often rely on. There's no interpretive leap required. The words describe exactly what happened and when. Crockett is careful to present only what is necessary, which makes the material harder to dismiss as cherry-picked. Each excerpt directly corresponds to claims Johnson previously made in public. The contradiction isn't argued, it's displayed. This is where the dynamic in the room begins to change. Lawmakers accustomed to rhetorical clashes now face documentation that cannot be interrupted or talked over. Crockett pauses after key lines, not for emphasis, but to let the silence do its work. The receipt doesn't accuse anyone on its own, but it removes plausible deniability. It confirms that decisions were not theoretical, not misunderstood, and not accidental. They were executed, recorded, and preserved. By grounding the discussion in the record, Crockett forces the debate onto terrain Johnson cannot easily control. Optics no longer matter as much as paper trails. From this point forward, every defense must contend with evidence that exists independently of narrative framing. Once the documentation is established, Crockett shifts to something even harder to explain away. Timing. She doesn't frame it as suspicious outright. She treats it as a factual sequence that deserves attention. She aligns Johnson's public assurances with the exact dates when key actions occurred, placing them side by side in a way that invites comparison rather than accusation. What emerges is not a single inconsistency, but a pattern of movement that feels carefully calibrated. Statements promising restraint are followed closely by actions that expand authority. Commitments to transparency precede procedural steps taken out of public view. The proximity matters. Crockett emphasizes that these weren't decisions made years apart under different circumstances. They happened within narrow windows, often days apart, sometimes hours. That closeness strips away the argument that conditions simply changed. Viewers are left to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the messaging and the maneuvering were never meant to align. Crockett lets the sequence speak for itself, walking through it slowly enough that the audience can anticipate the next turn before she names it. That anticipation creates unease, because the pattern becomes predictable. Every reassurance is followed by a quiet adjustment that undercuts it. The effect is cumulative. One timeline might be coincidence. Several form a rhythm. Crockett's restraint here is deliberate. She never labels the timing as deceptive. She simply asks why the most consequential moves consistently occur immediately after the public pressure subsides. By focusing on when things happened rather than why, she places the burden of explanation elsewhere. The audience begins connecting dots on their own, which makes the conclusion feel earned rather than imposed. Timing, in this context, becomes its own kind of evidence, not proving intent outright, but making alternative explanations increasingly difficult to sustain. At this point, Crockett pivots from what was done to how it was protected. She explains that the most effective shield wasn't secrecy, but procedure. Complex rules, layered approvals, and technical distinctions created insulation between decision-makers and public scrutiny. Johnson didn't need to defy norms when he could navigate them. Crockett lays out how authority was exercised through perfectly legal channels that few outside leadership circles ever examine closely. Committees moved items forward under routine classifications. Objections were limited by structure rather than debate. Deadlines and quorum rules narrowed who could intervene and when. None of it violates the handbook, and that's precisely the point. Crockett makes clear that procedure can function as both governance and camouflage. When decisions are fragmented across processes, accountability becomes diffuse. Johnson could point to compliance while avoiding responsibility for outcomes. Crockett doesn't argue that the rules themselves are corrupt. She shows how selectively invoking them can distort transparency. By emphasizing the mechanics, she reframes the issue from intent to design. The system worked exactly as it was leveraged to work. That realization lands heavily, because it means there's no single vote or motion to blame. The shield is structural. Crockett's explanation forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind footnotes, schedules, and procedural precedent. Johnson's reliance on these mechanisms wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The more Crockett explains how the process narrowed oversight, the clearer it becomes why earlier questions never gained traction. They weren't ignored. They were filtered out by design. By now, Crockett has laid enough groundwork to make the next move feel inevitable. She steps back and widens the frame, showing that what's been exposed so far isn't a one-off anomaly or a momentary lapse in judgment. She introduces additional instances that follow the same procedural logic, each occurring in different contexts but unfolding in strikingly similar ways. Different issue areas, different justifications, same operational blueprint. Each time, authority is exercised quietly, oversight is narrowed, and public assurances remain technically intact while outcomes shift underneath them. Crockett is careful not to overwhelm the audience. She spaces the examples deliberately, allowing each one to reinforce the last. The repetition is what does the damage. Once is defensible, twice invites questions. By the third example, coincidence becomes an increasingly fragile explanation. What's unsettling is how consistent the pattern feels, as though the process itself has been rehearsed. Crockett doesn't suggest improvisation or chaos. She suggests familiarity. These are moves made by someone comfortable operating in the gray zones of governance, confident that complexity will blunt accountability. As the examples accumulate, the narrative stops being about a single decision and starts being about habit. Viewers begin to recognize the structure before Crockett names it, which makes the realization more powerful. The same procedural shields, the same timing windows, the same reliance on technical compliance over substantive transparency. Crockett lets the pattern emerge organically, resisting the urge to label it too early. That restraint invites the audience to reach the conclusion themselves. By the time she finishes laying out the sequence, the question is no longer whether Johnson made a questionable call, but whether this approach defines how power is exercised under his leadership. What gives the entire presentation its force is what Crockett consistently refuses to do. She does not accuse, speculate, or editorialize beyond what the record supports. At moments where many politicians would pivot to moral condemnation or rhetorical flourish, she holds back. That restraint is strategic. It signals that she is not relying on outrage to carry the argument. Instead, she positions herself as a conduit for information that already exists, already matters, and already speaks loudly enough on its own. By avoiding inflammatory language, she denies critics an easy escape hatch. There is no tone to attack, no outburst to reframe as partisan theater. Every word she chooses feels intentional, almost minimalist. That economy of language builds trust with viewers who are conditioned to expect exaggeration. The absence of hyperbole becomes evidence of seriousness. Crockett's credibility is reinforced by how she handles uncertainty as well. When something cannot be definitively proven, she says so. When a conclusion is implied rather than explicit, she leaves it implied. That honesty about limits paradoxically strengthens the broader case. It communicates confidence that the strongest points do not need embellishment. This approach also shifts the burden onto Johnson and his allies. If the presentation were overtly hostile, they could dismiss it as political warfare. But restraint forces engagement with substance. The facts remain standing even if the speaker steps aside. Viewers sense that Crockett is building a record meant to outlast the news cycle, not dominate it for a single day. Her credibility doesn't come from asserting authority, but from demonstrating discipline. Each measured sentence suggests preparation, patience, and an understanding that the most damaging conclusions are often the ones the audience reaches on its own. The dynamic shifts again when Crockett introduces Johnson's own words into the sequence. Not paraphrased, not summarized, but quoted directly from prior statements and appearances that were once used to reinforce his credibility. She treats them with care, presenting them as fixed points in time rather than rhetorical targets. Each quote is anchored to a specific moment, a public commitment made clearly and without apparent ambiguity. Then she places those statements alongside the documented actions already entered into the record. The contrast is striking precisely because Crockett does not comment on it immediately. She allows the words to exist in tension with one another. What Johnson said then versus what occurred later. The effect is quiet but jarring. Viewers recognize the language because they've heard it before, often repeated by allies as proof of good faith. Hearing it again, now framed by outcomes that diverge from those assurances, changes its meaning. Crockett pauses after reading each excerpt, not to dramatize, but to give space for recognition. The silence invites comparison, and the comparison is not flattering. This moment is particularly difficult to deflect because it relies on no external interpretation. Johnson's words are uncontested, and the actions that followed are documented. The gap between them becomes the issue. Crockett still resists labeling it hypocrisy. She doesn't need to. By letting Johnson's statements reappear in this new context, she transforms them from defenses into liabilities. What once sounded like leadership now raises questions about intent and follow-through. The power of this move lies in its inevitability. Johnson cannot disown his own record without undermining the persona he's relied on. Crockett doesn't attack his credibility. She repositions it, showing how the very language used to build trust now complicates his defense. As the evidence and timeline stack up, Crockett begins to pull the lens back, showing not just Johnson's record but how the story has been treated externally. She points out that for weeks, media coverage has presented a sanitized, simplified version of events, a version that largely echoed Johnson's public messaging. Headlines emphasized his supposed consistency, his calm management, his principled stances. Yet the very documentation Crockett has presented exposes cracks in that narrative. She carefully explains that the media's role was never malicious. It was procedural. Outlets reported what was easily digestible, what fit into pre-existing frames of political storytelling. Complex procedural shifts, small timing manipulations, and bureaucratic maneuvers don't translate easily to sound bites. That's exactly what allowed the inconsistencies to persist unnoticed. Crockett's exposition highlights the tension between public narrative and reality. She shows that journalists covering the story faithfully reported statements without interrogating follow-up actions, creating a cumulative blind spot. The framing now strains because new evidence demands context the prior coverage never supplied. Crockett anticipates the expected defenses. That the media cannot cover everything, that details are technical, that interpretation is subjective. By addressing these points preemptively, she undermines the ability of Johnson's allies to dismiss the exposure as exaggerated or partisan. Instead, she presents a scenario where accountability is being forced to the surface, not invented. The strain becomes visible not just in her speech but in the reactions she subtly notes around the room. Observers, reporters, aides, even colleagues begin to adjust their posture, recognizing that prior narratives no longer hold. Crockett highlights how the pressure of reconciling public perception with documented actions creates a moment of tension where even established defenses begin to wobble. The audience begins to sense that a larger story is emerging, one where narratives carefully curated for public consumption cannot withstand scrutiny against the record. This is where the shift occurs. It is no longer about Johnson's individual statements or procedural maneuvers alone. The story has begun to outgrow the framework the media relied upon, forcing reconsideration, recalibration, and an inevitable confrontation between crafted image and documented reality. The strain is subtle but unmistakable, setting the stage for subsequent moments where accountability and exposure collide. At this stage, Crockett pivots the discussion from patterns and procedure to a simple but devastating question: accountability. She doesn't frame it as a rhetorical device. She frames it as a procedural and ethical imperative. Who authorized these decisions? Who ensured oversight at each stage? When did these actions move from discussion to execution? The answers are not easily found, and that is precisely her point. Crockett walks the audience through the mechanisms by which oversight was diluted. Committees with limited access, meetings held outside public schedules, and documents buried in archives all contributed to an environment where accountability was dispersed and obscured. The question hangs because there is no single person, or even a clearly defined group, who can be pointed to as responsible. The absence is not accidental. Crockett illustrates that this gap was created deliberately, a feature of the system Johnson exploited. The effect is cumulative. By repeatedly circling back to this question, she forces both the audience and Johnson's allies to confront what is otherwise ignored: the lack of a concrete, verifiable chain of responsibility. The longer the discussion goes, the more apparent it becomes that no amount of spin can fill this void. The question of accountability becomes a mirror reflecting institutional weakness, not just individual choice. She underscores that this is not a theoretical exercise. Real decisions affecting real outcomes have been made under this structure, and yet no one can be definitively held to account in the way the public expects from a system that claims transparency. The silence surrounding the question amplifies its weight. Each unanswered query becomes evidence in itself, suggesting complicity, oversight failure, or calculated avoidance. Viewers begin to understand that the issue is systemic, but the person at the center, Johnson, is the one whose credibility is most directly challenged. Crockett's insistence on this unanswered question generates tension because it cannot be deflected with talking points, reinterpretation, or procedural jargon. It demands a reckoning, and the room feels that pressure, as does anyone watching. By the time she moves on, the audience is already positioned to see subsequent revelations not as surprises, but as confirmations of the gaps in responsibility and transparency that have been deliberately left unaddressed. By the time Crockett reaches this point in her presentation, the room's energy has shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. She doesn't announce it, and she doesn't need to. The change is visible in the small, human reactions around her. Colleagues who were once focused intently on procedure now begin glancing away, shifting in their seats, checking notes or devices, avoiding prolonged eye contact. The moment isn't about dramatics, it's about recognition. They are sensing, in real time, the implications of what has just been laid out. Crockett has methodically built a case that combines timing, procedural exploitation, documented contradictions, and public statements that no longer align with outcomes. Each piece reinforces the last, and the pattern becomes almost unavoidable. Watching her unfold, it is uncomfortable because it exposes vulnerabilities many would prefer remained invisible. This is where social dynamics intersect with political calculus. When peers look away, it is not just discomfort. It is acknowledgement that the narrative she is constructing cannot easily be refuted. There is no applause, no overt reaction, only the collective shift of attention. In political environments, these subtle cues are as meaningful as public statements. They indicate uncertainty, hesitation, and the beginnings of self-preservation. Staffers and colleagues instinctively recognize that association with contested actions could have consequences, and this recognition manifests physically, even if silently. Crockett doesn't comment on it directly. She allows it to register with the audience. Viewers notice the behavioral shifts, which heightens the tension. The realization that Johnson's position is no longer fully supported, even among those who operate in the same circles, creates a psychological pressure that complements the evidence already presented. The impact is cumulative, signaling that exposure is effective not just on paper, but socially, altering the dynamics of power and influence in ways that formal argument alone cannot achieve. In these moments, the room itself becomes a secondary narrator, underscoring Crockett's points through the reactions her evidence provokes. As the immediate evidence and procedural details settle, Crockett begins to widen the frame, inviting the audience to see the bigger picture. She shifts from individual actions and isolated decisions to the systemic implications of Johnson's conduct. It is not just about one speaker or a single chamber. It's about the precedents being set, the norms being quietly reshaped, and the expectations of accountability being recalibrated. Crockett emphasizes that when procedural shields are relied upon repeatedly to protect decisions from scrutiny, it does more than obscure individual outcomes. It erodes trust in the institutions themselves. What voters see publicly, she explains, is increasingly disconnected from what actually occurs behind the scenes. By presenting patterns of action alongside the carefully curated narrative, she highlights how transparency is compromised, not by overt corruption, but by structural manipulation. The implications extend beyond Johnson's personal credibility. They ripple through the institution, affecting committees, staff, and future leadership who may interpret these maneuvers as a blueprint for power maintenance. Crockett draws attention to the message sent to both colleagues and constituents. Strategic opacity can function as an effective shield. That realization forces viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about governance, oversight, and the very nature of representative accountability. She also underscores the political cost of these precedents. Future attempts at reform or challenge may be stymied, not by opposition, but by the normalization of procedural maneuvering that now appears routine. By stepping back in this way, Crockett elevates the stakes. The audience begins to see that this is not a matter of partisan critique, but of systemic consequence. The decisions, timing, and shields previously examined now coalesce into a broader story about power, trust, and the mechanisms that allow influence to operate unchecked. Viewers are left grappling with the structural weight of Johnson's approach, understanding that the implications are long-lasting and institution-wide. The lens is no longer just on him, it is on the system he has exploited and the precedents he has established. Crockett's meticulous buildup ensures the audience perceives the full scope, making the stakes feel immediate, tangible, and deeply consequential. By the time Crockett has laid out timelines, patterns, procedural shields, and broader implications, Johnson's defenses begin to buckle under their own weight. Every justification previously offered, every carefully worded statement, every technical explanation, every appeal to process, starts to conflict with another, forming a lattice of contradictions that is increasingly difficult to reconcile. Crockett does not need to exaggerate or editorialize. The collapse happens almost organically. The audience can see it because the record she presents makes previous defenses unsustainable. What was once presented as principled adherence to rules now appears selective, calculated, and opportunistic. She demonstrates, step by step, that actions once framed as exceptions are part of a consistent operational strategy. As each layer is peeled back, the rationales previously invoked become harder to maintain. Johnson's spokespeople or allies, if they attempt to respond, are immediately trapped between competing statements and documented facts. Deflection becomes ineffective because the contradictions are self-contained and undeniable. Crockett allows this to happen without commentary. The audience witnesses the internal tension and understands that any public defense is now reactive rather than proactive. This methodical dismantling creates a psychological pressure distinct from the procedural or factual arguments already presented. The perception of inevitability begins to settle in. What viewers feel is not just the exposure of misalignment between words and actions, but the unraveling of a strategy built on controlling narrative and exploiting procedural complexity. The weight of documentation, repeated patterns, and public statements converges, leaving Johnson with fewer and fewer credible avenues for response. Crockett's approach highlights that this is not a single vulnerability but an interconnected web, where each prior defense undermines another, and the whole framework starts to collapse inward. By the time she reaches the next stage, the audience is primed to understand that the situation has escalated beyond simple contradiction. It is systemic, undeniable, and inescapable, leaving Johnson isolated against the cumulative force of evidence, observation, and structural accountability. The turning point comes not through dramatic declaration, but through the convergence of everything Crockett has carefully built. Up to this moment, she has established patterns, timelines, documented contradictions, procedural shields, and the social signals of discomfort in the room. Now, all of these elements align to create a moment where the weight of the information becomes undeniable. Crockett delivers a summary that is concise, precise, and strategically phrased, less a verdict than an observation that reframes everything that preceded it. She does not shout or signal triumph. Instead, She allows the clarity of the evidence to speak for itself, letting the audience, both in the room and at home, draw the inevitable conclusion. The effect is immediate and visceral. Lawmakers and aides shift in their seats. Reporters exchange subtle glances, and the room fills with an almost imperceptible tension. The turning point is psychological as much as it is factual. Viewers begin to feel the culmination of the narrative arc without needing it to be spelled out. All prior examples now take on new weight in light of the summary, making contradictions and procedural manipulations impossible to ignore. Crockett's delivery ensures that this moment lands precisely where the audience is most receptive, between acknowledgement of the evidence and anticipation of what comes next. The tension is magnified because, up until this point, Johnson's defenses, both procedural and rhetorical, seemed plausible. Now, the narrative shifts from ambiguity to clarity. The audience recognizes a tipping point has been reached. Actions that once appeared isolated or defensible now form a clear, coherent pattern that cannot be dismissed. It is a quiet explosion of comprehension, an accumulation of understanding that transforms unease into a recognition of consequence. By letting the evidence, patterns, and reactions converge naturally, Crockett engineers a moment where the story pivots sharply. What was once background now becomes front and center, and viewers realize the stakes are far higher than they initially imagined. This is where inevitability sets in, and the momentum she has built carries the audience fully into the climactic stages of exposure. At this stage, Crockett underscores the gravity of what has been exposed by shifting attention to the consequences of acknowledgement. She frames the argument in terms of structural and procedural inevitability, emphasizing that Johnson cannot simply issue clarifications or walk back prior actions without undermining the very framework he relied on. The decisions in question are not isolated incidents that can be excused as mistakes. They are deliberate maneuvers executed within procedural systems designed to insulate authority while limiting scrutiny. Crockett explains that the public record, the documented timelines, and the repeated patterns now exist independently of Johnson's narrative control. Each element reinforces the others, creating a lattice of evidence that cannot be erased or reframed without contradicting previous statements and commitments. Attempting to walk back the exposure would require acknowledging that the systems and safeguards he touted as neutral were, in practice, leveraged to achieve outcomes that contradict his public assurances. Crockett emphasizes that this isn't simply a matter of optics. It is about accountability in its most formal sense. Any effort to dismiss or minimize the revelations would inevitably highlight the very structural manipulations that have been concealed, turning defense into further liability. The audience begins to see that Johnson's position has become precarious not because of partisan attack, but because the evidence itself is self-reinforcing. Each procedural shield, each carefully timed decision, each contradiction between words and actions now functions as a visible constraint on plausible deniability. Crockett's explanation also highlights the social and political dimensions of the fallout. Colleagues, aides, and even media observers are now forced to reconcile prior perceptions with the new reality. Any public defense risks contradicting observable facts or signaling complicity in a system that has now been laid bare. In this way, Crockett frames the moment as irreversible. The exposure is no longer about persuasion, it is about the permanence of documented reality. Johnson's options are constrained not by opinion, but by the cumulative weight of evidence, timing, and precedent. Viewers understand that the story cannot be rewound or contained, and that the implications will continue to unfold regardless of subsequent statements or attempts at narrative control. By the time Crockett reaches this stage, the impact of her exposition has already begun to ripple outward, even before any formal action is taken. The fallout is visible not just in words, but in gestures, shifts in posture, and the subtle recalibrations of those within the chamber and beyond. Staffers whisper quietly to one another, aides check messages and consult notes, and reporters begin adjusting their framing mid-sentence. Crockett highlights that these reactions are a direct consequence of the evidence she has methodically presented. The patterns, procedural manipulations, and contradictions have already destabilized Johnson's previously curated narrative, and those closest to the situation instinctively recognize the precariousness it creates. Importantly, Crockett makes the audience aware that political calculations are immediate. Allies who once spoke confidently about Johnson's consistency begin to hedge their statements, careful not to contradict the record she has laid out. Opponents and observers alike start to sense that the window for spin has narrowed dramatically, as the story now carries the weight of tangible documentation, procedural clarity, and social acknowledgement of tension. She emphasizes that the fallout is not hypothetical. It is unfolding in real time. Every email, briefing, and media headline that follows will now be filtered through the lens of this exposure. Crockett allows the audience to see that consequence is no longer abstract or contingent. It is already operating in real-world dynamics. The uncertainty in the room, the recalibration of support, and the instinctive distancing by colleagues all signal that Johnson's position is under pressure even before any formal vote, statement, or gavel. This creates a dual-layer effect. Viewers absorb both the factual impact of the revelations and the social proof that the situation is serious. By framing the fallout as immediate and perceptible, Crockett elevates the tension, showing that political consequences often manifest as shifts in perception and alignment long before formal accountability measures occur. The audience comes to understand that the exposure has momentum, and that once a story has this kind of weight, even inaction cannot prevent the chain reaction it has triggered. Crockett closes the presentation in a way that is deceptively simple but profoundly effective. She does not demand resignation, issue ultimatums, or declare judgment. Instead, she leaves the room, and viewers, facing the evidence itself, unaltered and unresolved. The unanswered ending is intentional. It is crafted to make the audience sit with the implications rather than having them spelled out. Every contradiction, every procedural nuance, every timing discrepancy, every documented action. All of it remains standing, and Johnson's own defenses have been exposed as increasingly unsustainable. By withholding a direct call to action, Crockett forces the audience to engage intellectually and emotionally. Viewers are left asking themselves the questions she has implicitly raised. How will Johnson respond? Who will hold him accountable? Can the system withstand the precedent he has set? This strategy amplifies engagement because curiosity and tension are sustained. The story doesn't conclude neatly, and the uncertainty drives attention. The power of leaving the ending unresolved lies in its realism. In politics, outcomes are rarely immediate or absolute. By reflecting this truth, Crockett's narrative feels credible, urgent, and authentic. The audience becomes complicit in drawing the lines between evidence and consequence. At the same time, the unanswered ending highlights the social and institutional ramifications already in motion. Staffers, colleagues, and media outlets are already recalibrating, even if no formal steps have been taken. By showing this ripple effect without overt commentary, Crockett allows viewers to witness the impact of accountability, or the lack thereof, without the narrative dictating a particular judgment. It is a masterclass in psychological tension. The story feels complete in its exposition but incomplete in resolution, leaving a lingering sense of anticipation. The unanswered ending also functions as a narrative echo, reinforcing all the patterns, contradictions, and procedural manipulations previously outlined. Every moment Crockett has methodically presented now resonates more sharply because there is no neat conclusion to contain or neutralize their weight. The audience is left with an open question that cannot be ignored. How does someone survive a systematic exposure that meticulously documents the gap between words and actions, and what will the consequences be when those dynamics inevitably unfold? The effect is magnetic, ensuring that attention remains fixed not just on the story presented, but on the future developments it implies. It is this tension, the interplay between full revelation and unresolved outcome, that compels viewers to stay engaged, thinking, analyzing, and anticipating what comes next.